Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. I'm Apoor from Shiksha Study Abroad, India's #1 study abroad website. Today we are presenting on the important topic of how to write a compelling UG application essay, presented by Shane, Assistant Director of Admissions at Vanderbilt University, and joining us is Anubhooti Arora, Education USA Advisor. So before we begin, just a little bit of an housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box into your GoToWebinar platform, and we'll take them as and when, we'll take a pause. I'll bring them during the presentation. So if there are any questions, feel free to type in the chat box. As and when the questions pop up, we'll be taking up. So without any further ado, we'll turn over to Anubhooti. She'll be telling you more about Education USA, and we'll be moving forward. So Anubhooti, you'll just take the lead.
Thank you so much. Is my screen visible? Sorry, just a second.
Yes, Anubhooti, you can go ahead.
Is my screen visible? Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see the presentation on my screen. I'm going to talk to you. My name is Anubhooti Arora. I'm going to talk to you today about Education USA and how we guide and advise Indian students on the US university admissions process. I just want to make sure that my screen is visible to everybody. Mahesh, can you help me out with that?
Yeah, Anubhooti, the screen is visible. If you would want, you can just maximize or go on the full screen mode on the PPT.
Right, okay. Right. So, just a second.
Click on current slide. I think that'll.
All right. Okay, great. Yeah. So Education USA is a US State Department network of advising centers that provide accurate, current, and comprehensive information to students, families, and academicians on US higher educational opportunities. We have 8 centers in India, Delhi being the headquarters, and we're located in 170 countries with 450 centers. We work very closely with US embassies and consulates all over the world as well as in India, and we partner very closely with accredited US higher educational institutions, like, for example, we have Vanderbilt University with us today in disseminating information on the application process. And today we're going to talk about writing the undergraduate application essays. US universities, when they look at selecting and when they're reviewing high school applications from all over the world, they employ a holistic review process to evaluate students. And what does this holistic review process mean? It basically means that universities look at your academic graph, or they look at how students have performed through high school, which means from grade 9 to grade 12. And typically an academic graph that is on the escalation mode or something, or if you're performing well and you're improving your grades year on year, that's something very positive. Consistent academic performance is also looked upon favorably. US universities also look at extracurricular activities of students, so basically what students are doing outside the classroom walls. Academic honors such as the National Talent Search examination, excellent performance in academics are looked upon very favorably. Standardized tests such as the SAT and the ACT give US universities an understanding of how you compare with peers in other countries that are following a different educational format or board. Universities also look at students who may have leadership potential, for example, being a sports captain, or the head boy or the head girl or the vice president of your student council. They look at softer characteristics, characteristics that go beyond numbers in terms of things like your character, your intellectual curiosity, your willingness to learn and grow. They look at what your teachers and your counselors have to say to you in the form of letters of recommendation, and they also look at how good a fit you are with their school. So the US has a great diversity in terms of educational institutions. There are 4,500 universities in the US, accredited universities in the US, and more than 2,500 offer at least undergraduate education, exclusively undergraduate education. So you're spoiled for choices, and universities are definitely looking at how good a fit you will be for their school. So I'll hand it over to Shane now to talk about the college application essays, which are a great insight into who you are as a person and the softer characteristics I spoke about earlier.
All right. Thank you so much. So now it looks like we switched over to my screen. So as I said, my name is Shane McGuire. I'm from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee in the United States. In case you don't know where that is, which I wouldn't necessarily expect you to, it's a little bit more in sort of the southeast part of the country there, in sort of an amazing city right there. But yes, so great introduction here about sort of how we review applications. It is very much a holistic process.
Shane,
a lot of things.
Sorry to interrupt. Shane, I guess like your screen is not visible, so if you can just open up the PPT once.
It's in presentation mode. Let me see.
Just try it once.
Is that better?
Yeah, it is better, definitely.
Okay. That's okay. I hadn't shown any slides yet, so we're good. But I was saying, yeah, it's very much a holistic process. There's a lot of things that we're looking at in this application, and today we're really going to focus on one piece of that, and that is the college essay. So, this is really the first time in the application where we really get to hear from you directly as a student. Most of the application, it's your academic record, which is coming from your high school, it's your test scores, it's these letters of recommendation that are written by amazing people saying amazing things about you. We have the things you're doing outside the classroom, but really throughout the application, we rarely get to hear sort of your voice and hear from you. And so the essay is really one of those places. And it's really a chance for you to sort of speak directly to the committee and sort of share your voice, and really for them to learn a little bit about you. It's a short essay. They can't learn everything about you, but they can learn something new. They can get a glimpse into sort of who you are, your story, your background, your personality. And the essay can really sort of bring your application to life. And I think any admissions counselor would tell you, when reading an application, this is our favorite part, because this is a chance to sort of get beyond just the numbers, beyond just the things that you're doing. And it really helps really bring that application to life. Is more than just this, hey, I'm a test score with a GPA and these are the things that I do, but we get a little bit more than that. And it can also help as we think about sort of, are you a good fit for the university, as we get to sort of hear maybe your thoughts or your worldviews or your attitudes on things or experiences that you've had or personal qualities that make you different. So this essay is really a way that you can sort of bring that application to life in a new light. So really, what we're going to kind of do is talk about how you can do that, some essay writing tips, and then of course about halfway through I'll open it up for some questions, and then we'll also leave time for questions at the end. But as you will see, these are going to be very general tips because there is not a formula to the perfect essay. I wish there was. I'm sure that'd make your life easier, that'd make our life easier, but there's a lot of ways that you can write a really, really amazing essay. So here are some of the common topics that you may see on a college application. Sometimes if you're on the common application or the coalition application or the universal college application, you'll see some prompts. Also, a lot of schools in the United States have supplemental essays. And so these are a few of the ones that you may come across the most. This is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the ones that you see. So I kind of want to talk through these quickly, and also maybe give you a few pointers on if you tackle one of these essays. So one you see a lot is the tell us about yourself essay, which is always a tough one because that is very, very general, but you usually don't have a lot of words to tell about yourself. So the key, I think, if you end up seeing that topic is just to make sure you don't try to do too much. And you're going to hear that as kind of a theme throughout today is these essays are short, and you can't tell us your whole life story in this essay, and no college is expecting you to get everything across. So figure out what you really want to communicate. When you see this very open-ended tell us about yourself question, tell us about something about yourself, but not necessarily everything about yourself. You'll sometimes see the academic interest essay where you want to sort of express an interest that you have in a certain area and maybe why you have that. So if you tackle that sort of essay, just make sure you've done some research into that area and that you have a pretty good idea of why you're interested in that. And you can say more than just, I'm really good at that particular subject. Go beyond that and be able to sort of give them a little glimpse as to why you have found an interest in that particular academic essay. A lot of times you'll see an activity essay. Sometimes this is just a short answer. Sometimes this is a full essay. But this is really a chance for you to provide more information about one activity you're doing outside the classroom. And sometimes students are like, well, which one do I pick? How do I know which one a college wants to hear? There's not necessarily a set answer to that, but we just want to see that you're talking about maybe something you're most passionate about or the activity where you think you've had the biggest impact. And as you're writing this essay, you don't need to necessarily sum up the activity. We have a pretty good idea if you're in a club or a sport or music or service or a job. Like, we have a general idea of what you're doing. This is your opportunity to sort of tell us impacts, accomplishments, achievements. If you have a leadership role in an activity, what made you different than the leader that came before you? If you're in this particular club, what is something you did to sort of change or make it better? This is your chance to dive a little deeper and not so much describing the activity, but describing sort of your role in that activity. A lot of times, particularly on supplements, you're going to see why this school essay. And this is one where you really, really, really need to do your research on the front end. Make sure you have visited that school's website, that you've looked over different offerings that they have, that you've maybe got on the social media, maybe you've looked at their virtual tour, but you want to have a good idea of the type of student that does well there and sort of what they might be looking for in a student and sort of how they would describe their community, because you want to be able to say more in that essay than, hey, I really want to come to your school because I've heard it's really, really good and I think I could add to it. You need to be able to say more than that. You need to be able to say why this school is different and why they might have something that would be really beneficial to you, or why you'd be a good fit for that school, because usually if they're asking this question, they're going to be looking to really see that you're a good fit. Sometimes you see the important current issue. Sometimes colleges are looking for the type of student that's up with current issues and can really sort of have that dialogue, because a lot of times in the classroom, you're going to be talking about current events all across the world, and so they're sometimes looking to see, are those students in high school that are engaging with that and having those conversations and can talk about those things well. So, if you decide to tackle that essay, just make sure you've done some research. You've hopped on and read some articles online, or kept up with the local news or what's going on around the world, so you can kind of write that informed essay. Sometimes you see this, and this is a very general way of putting it, but this sort of amaze us with your cleverness and creativity type essay. And so sometimes you'll see a more obscure topic that's a little bit more creative, trying to sort of get at that creative side. And if this is an option that you have and you're a creative person, go for it. But also don't feel like this is necessarily one you have to tackle if you're not a creative person. Keep in mind that as we are shaping college campuses, we're not looking for one type of student. Not every student that we bring to campus has to be the top leader or has to be the most creative person. We want diverse campuses. So think about what you're interested in, what is your personality, and then use that to maybe drive what essay that you pick. And then a lot of times you're going to see some sort of topic that relates to the important risk or event in your life. And I think students automatically assume that it has to be this huge life-changing event. And frankly, at this point in your life, at 17 or 18 years old, when you're applying to college, you may not have had a huge life-changing event. I think some of the biggest life-changing events are still ahead of you. And maybe you have, and that's totally fine, and that's definitely an essay you can have, but it doesn't have to be this big thing. It could be a small, everyday thing that you did that was kind of unique to you or special to you or original to sort of who you are, that made you think differently or challenged you in a new way or pushed you in a new way. but it doesn't have to be this huge event. It can definitely be something smaller, something even more mundane in everyday life. So again, these are not the comprehensive list of topics that you would see, but a few of the bigger ones that are out there, and a little bit of advice on sort of how to go about tackling these essays. So as you're starting to think about what topic do I choose, how do I go about figuring out which one is me, you're going to have to do some self-reflection here. You're going to have to do a little bit of...
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Shane. Like, we are
fine.
receiving some of the questions from the students. So is it a good time? Should we take one or two questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take questions. We can make this more of a dialogue back and forth, so I'm happy to take some questions here.
No problem, Shane. So we have received one of the questions from Prashant. He says that his academics are not good for class 9th and 11th, and he has a year gap. So can the essays cover up for the part where he can express what went wrong, or like he can probably clarify and compensate if, that would elevate his chances of getting through?
That's a great question, and I think sometimes students feel like, if there is something about their application that they're worried about, that they feel like they have to use the essay to sort of talk about that. And sometimes students have, and you can, but I also think you have other places in the application which you could actually do that. And I tend to steer students to the additional information section, because you have this empty box at the end of the application where you can legitimately talk about anything that you want. And if you feel like there's something in your application that an admissions office is going to have questions about or is going to be concerned about, you can address it there. So you could write a couple sentences. And you don't have to write a full essay. You could just write a few sentences or a paragraph sort of explaining what was going on, the context of maybe why those grades were lower, and that way you're not having to necessarily use that space where you could also write a very compelling essay. So I would probably steer that student to use that space. That way you then have another chance to use the actual essay to convey something about your personality, and don't almost, I don't want to say waste it, but almost have to use that space to talk about the academic piece.
That's some great insight, Shane. Like, thanks for sharing the same. So we have another question from Ishan here. He says, do essays matter more than the extra co-curriculars?
Also a great question. And so I think I get a lot of questions from students about, there's a lot of parts of the application that you all reviewed. You have a certain weighting. Does something weigh more than the other? And that's part of the holistic review, is there's not necessarily something that's going to outweigh all these other things. I'm sure each university might have certain things they value more, or they get a little bit more from certain things than the other, but it's not really a uniform thing. I mean, really, particularly in highly selective admissions or even selective admissions, I mean, a lot of these aspects have to be there. The academic performance, the solid testing, the extracurriculars, the essay, the letters of recommendation, sort of all aspects are there. But again, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which they can look at it, but something is not necessarily weighing more than the other in this process. I mean, really, we are trying to sort of look at the student, the whole package, the whole story, and we can pull that from a lot of different areas. But there's also lots of ways for students to stand out. I mean, some students stand out in the application pool because they have an amazing extracurricular activity that we don't see that often, or they have a huge accomplishment. Others stand out because they write this compelling, amazing essay, or another stands out because they have this letter of recommendation that says, like, they're the best student that that teacher or that counselor has ever seen. Or maybe there's something crazy they're doing academic. I mean, there's a lot of ways that students can stand out, but we're sort of still looking at the whole application as we make these decisions.
That's great to hear, Shane. So before we move on, like, I just want to take this one last question. So that is from Anushrita. She says that, what if I don't have quite much of the activities to talk about? Like, what if, like, a student is more into academics and hasn't devoted much of the time in the extra co-curricular? So how can these people deal with the essays?
No, that's a great question. And again, it's for us in this process, and I didn't dive into it too much yet, but context is everything. So before we're even trying to sort of review the application, we are really trying to understand the context of where the student is coming from. The school that they're coming from, what's offered at that school in and outside the classroom. And we know particularly internationally, that there are schools that put a higher focus on academics and aren't pushing the extracurriculars as much, or may not even have as many opportunities for students. And our job is not to sort of judge a student for why are they at this particular school, or why does this particular school do things the way they do. We are looking to see what are the opportunities that a student has at that school, and then how are they taking advantage of that. So we will have that context in play, and we understand different parts of the world function differently in terms of academics and extracurricular activities. But again, the essay is not so much trying to cover those things. Sure, you might have an essay that is an activity essay, but again, that's sometimes not even one that you have to pick. But the essay is really trying to get more at the personality, the story, the experience of the student, their background, worldview, sort of who they are. It's not really a space where a student should be repeating what's in the academics or the extracurriculars. So even if they don't have a lot of extracurricular activities, this essay is still just trying to get at sort of who they are as a person, and not so much necessarily what they're doing outside the classroom.
Thanks a lot for sharing the inside chain. Like you can continue. We'll take up the questions again.
Sure.
But as of now, you can just take on. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds great. So kind of getting back to how do I choose a topic? How do I really settle in on what I want to write about? And again, this sort of has to be self-reflection, and you'll have to do a little sort of digging inside to sort of basically try to figure out what makes you who you are. And I know that's sometimes a tough thing to think about, but you're going to kind of have to think about, if you had to write about yourself, if you had to talk about yourself, how would you describe yourself? And I know this is challenging because probably at no point during your high school career have you had to write about yourself. Most of your papers are research papers, maybe a response paper to something going on in class or a reflection about something, but rarely do you actually have to write about yourself. And that can be a little bit challenging. I mean, some people aren't very good. In fact, I think most people aren't that good at talking about themselves. I'm terrible at it. And so when I've had to write personal essays, I've really had to give myself some lead time to make sure that I kind of can self-reflect and sort of try to communicate the best that I can. And keep in mind, it's hard to communicate a personality on a piece of paper, and colleges recognize that. It'd be much easier if we could sit across the table from every single applicant and sort of learn about them and learn about their personality. So we recognize the challenge that you have in putting it down on paper, but you certainly want to try the best you can to communicate who you are. And think about themes in your life. How would your friends describe you? How would your parents, your family describe you if they had to? And you can even ask them if you want to, but what sort of defines who you are as a person? And then kind of once you do some brainstorming on that and you start to think about the ways you would describe yourself and the ways you would describe your life, decide which of those are most important to you. And I think sometimes students think, well, there's a certain thing that a college wants to hear, like they're looking for this one theme or this one characteristic. And that's not at all the case. I mean, you need to figure out, what do you want us to know? Don't worry about what we want to hear, because at the end of the day, there is not a set thing that we're looking to hear or a set thing that we're expecting a student to write about. We want the student to be authentic to who they are. So think about, what do you want the reader to know? If you had to share one thing with the reader of your application that they don't find anywhere else, what would it be? So use that to sort of guide that as you're really deciding which of these topics. Keep in mind that the main essay, again, supplemental essays will be a little bit more specific to schools, but the main personal statement is a personal statement. When I'm doing this presentation live, I always ask students, so who should a personal statement be about? And sometimes they look at me with blank stares, and I'm like, this is not a trick question. It's about you. It should be all about you in this process. So you should be the center of the essay. And I think one of the most common mistakes that I see with students is they sort of pick a topic. Maybe they pick a risk or an event or a character that they're going to relate to, and they end up spending the majority of the essay talking about the event, talking about the risk, talking about that character, and then they write 2 sentences at the end about how they relate to that. And so that's not a personal essay. I've learned all about that event, I've learned all about that fictional character or whatever it is, but I've learned very, very little about the student. So depending on what you're writing about, a little context is great, but the focus of the essay should be on the student. So as you're thinking about, this topic, you can sort of take what you've decided that you want a university and a college to know, and you can start to sort of adapt that information to sort of the question that's being asked. And really, these questions on an application are more sort of a guide, like a jumping off point for you. I mean, you still want to try to answer the question, but you also, at the end of it, are really just trying to communicate something about yourself to that. And don't think about, like, I have this question and I feel like I just have to write this super impressive way, like I've got to pull out the thesaurus, I have to use all these big words, I have to try to sound like a different person, like someone better than I am. And I think a lot of times you put pressure on yourselves to be something that you're not in this process, and that is not at all what we want. We want you to be authentic. We want you to be who you are, because we're admitting you as a student, so we want to know who you are, not who you think you should be. We want you to be who you are in this process. So as you're kind of thinking about the essay, again, you want to sort of show us and not just tell us who you are, but you kind of want to talk about, yourself through this. And again, I see a lot of times where students feel like they have to sort of tell the whole life story. And so they sort of end up writing an essay that's just sort of a list of events in their life. They're talking about one experience here and what they like to do in the classroom and outside the classroom and something about a friend or an interaction. It ends up sort of being this list, and it gives me like a general overview of the student, but I'm not getting a lot of depth there because they're trying to tell me too much in the application. Again, you cannot tell me your whole life story in 500 to 650 words, which is generally the length that you have in these essays, and we're not expecting you to. So keep it focused, keep it sort of as a snapshot of who you are. And again, you're not just telling us about an action or an event or sort of describing the story. You're telling us about your role in that, your reaction to that, and sort of how it impacted you or may have changed how you think or your worldview or whatever impact it may have had on you. So as you're starting now, you kind of have an idea of maybe a topic, sort of what you want to write about and how you sort of want to go about doing this. You're at the starting line. So, think about, again, as you're brainstorming who you are, what you've accomplished, sort of where you're headed next. Again, this continuous theme here of you can't do everything in here. You don't need to repeat other things in your application. Think small. I sort of like to say that this is the slice of life. So a snapshot, a glimpse, just a little bit of information about who you are. Because if you keep it focused, you'll then really be able to show depth and sort of, a little more insight than you would be if you were just to sort of try to tell us a little bit about everything. So I like the sort of saying the think small and then build off of that as you're sort of writing and drafting this essay. So hopefully you're not overwhelmed yet, but again, I think you go into this process of thinking about a topic and writing an essay, and you put a lot of pressure on yourself, and sometimes you end up just staring at a screen or staring at a piece of paper, and you just don't even know where to begin. So before you begin, let's just all take a deep breath, relax. Keep in mind this is supposed to be fun. I know that that's a little tricky because you're like, wait, I'm writing an essay. How can writing an essay actually be fun? But this is fun because this is not a classroom assignment. This is not something you're writing for your English or your science or your history class. This is not going off to a teacher to be graded. You're getting to write kind of a fun essay about you. And keep in mind that there are humans on the other side of this that are reading your application, and we've all been there. We have all been in your shoes. Back when I applied to school, we had to do everything by paper, but outside of that, we had to write these essays too. We had to try to communicate something about ourselves, and I remember how nervous and daunting that seemed as a student in high school. Like, how in the world am I supposed to talk about myself to these schools? And what are they going to think and what do they want to hear from me? And so I put a lot of pressure on myself, but really, don't worry too much about it, because we've been there, we understand what you're going through, and the goal and hopefully the takeaway from this is we just want you to write about you, tell your story, but don't put this extra pressure on you. I mean, at the end of the day, college is fun, and I know filling out an application maybe isn't the most fun, or writing an essay isn't the most fun, but if you try to go into it and say, hey, this is going to be fun, let me have fun with this essay, I think you might find that writing the essay maybe isn't as bad as having to write that paper for class, or at least I hope not in this process. So then, well, how do I even start? I mean, sometimes, you sit down and you're like, all right, I'm just going to try to write this perfect draft the first time, and so you sit there and you're staring at your piece of paper, you're staring at your computer screen for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, 30 minutes, and you've written one sentence because you're like, I don't even know how to get this started. It is very rare for anybody to be able to sort of sit down and just write a perfect first draft. It's probably going to take you a little while to get this. And I'm a big fan of the free write. I know I've done a number of in-person workshops where I actually make students pull out a piece of paper. I give them sort of a starting topic, and I give them a time limit of a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and I'm like, just write whatever comes to mind. Doesn't even have to be complete sentences. Write words, phrases. If you want to start writing just whatever comes to mind, even if it doesn't flow that well, just do it. Just start trying to put some thoughts down on paper. Look at a question or look at this topic and say, okay, what do I want to write about? Don't worry about punctuation. Don't even worry about spelling, grammar. Don't worry about that at this point. You're just trying to get some thoughts down on paper. So maybe try that at home. Set a stopwatch, set a timer, and just write. And then sometimes I'll have students, like after they've written for 3 to 5 minutes, then go through and underline some of the phrases or the words or the sentences that they really, really liked, and then use that as a jumping off point and do the exercise again and write for another 5 minutes. And you can do that a couple times, maybe even 3 or 4 or 5 times. And by the time you've done that, you now suddenly have a draft, or at least a paragraph or a couple paragraphs to at least get you started. And then you can always go back and edit and add in the grammar and check the spelling, because you're not submitting it right away. So just try to get some thoughts down on paper, and then you can tweak it and work with it. But sometimes these free writes can really be very, very helpful as you're starting to at least brainstorm. And then you may also start brainstorming. You may start writing thoughts and ideas down on paper, and then you're like, I don't actually like how this is going. And that's okay too. A lot of students sometimes have to tackle more than one topic to sort of get what they really want to. But unless you start sort of putting thoughts down on paper, you're not really going to sort of be able to know that in this process. So again, this can be a fun exercise and a way to at least help you get started as you try to put thoughts down on paper. So I also wanted to throw out some of these topics that have been done before. And again, I'm not necessarily telling you that you have to avoid these topics, but keep in mind that if you tackle one of these, you are going to have to sort of work a little bit harder to potentially stand out, because other students may also be writing about this topic. So let's talk about sort of some of these, and I'll expand on sort of what these mean. But sometimes students write about, the trip of a lifetime, or a vacation that they had, or going away to a camp, or some sort of service project they did for a week. And again, those can all be great topics, but if you're going to do something like this, make sure you find a way to sort of, again, put a little extra spin on it. Again, there's a lot of pressure on this process for you to be unique, and it's very, very hard to actually be unique in this process. But if you are telling something that's your story and a little more original to you, that can be different. But again, just remember, if you're tackling some of these topics, other students are writing about these things as well. I'll see some essays that sort of tell me all their favorite things. And so again, this can get a little list heavy and not as focused, but they'll tell me about they love puppies, and they love sports, and they love to eat Oreos, and which is great. But again, you end up getting a little bit list heavy when you do something like that, and it can really sort of lose the focus of the essay. I sort of joke here, this is sort of like the Miss Universe answer, where you're sort of like, world peace. Like, when they ask the question is, what is the one thing that you wish existed? And they answer world peace, sort of as the generic answer there. So again, if you decide to tackle one of those issues, current issues that are going on in the world, or maybe going on in your home country or even your home city, think about what is something that's maybe a little bit more specific to you and maybe isn't one of those more popular topics that probably everyone is writing about. There's also the athlete essay. I can't even begin to tell you how many athlete essays I have read in my life, and this is not at all a knock on athletes. Athletes are great. They have amazing experiences. There's a lot of things that come from being on a team and winning a tournament and winning a championship, and that can definitely stand out in your extracurricular activities. But keep in mind, we have a lot of students that write about their experience, through a sport, through an experience in a game. There's a lot that are talking about. I've also read a lot about athletic injuries, where I've even read a number of essays that start off with some sort of quote of snap or break, or there goes my ACL or my muscle, or there's a tear, and then they talk about how they rebounded from that injury and ultimately their team won the state championship. I've read that essay 1,000 times, and again, that's an incredible experience. That's overcoming an obstacle. But there's a lot of students that are doing that, and I would say don't ever start off an essay that says snap, break. It's an interesting start to an essay. So again, if you do the athlete essay, just know there's a lot of people writing about that. The autobiography, this gets a little bit to sort of the tell me about yourself question, and so some students, do the hi, my name is this, and they sort of go through that story. But again, if you're trying to do an autobiography, you're going to try to do too much with very, very limited space. The tales of my very big success, again, this goes, crossing the finish line, or a huge, huge accomplishment that you have. You can talk about those in the extracurriculars. You can sort of brag about those things. And when I say brag, I mean, you need to talk about yourself in these extracurriculars. You need to let your accomplishments shine in this process. This is not a time to really hold anything back. But you can talk about that there, and then maybe talk about, if you're talking about a success in your essay, talk about the thought process that you had, or some of the behind-the-scenes stuff of sort of what you're dealing with internally, or how you helped make that happen. But you don't necessarily have to, talk about just the actual success itself. Sometimes I read an essay about, the pet death, which obviously that is a big event in someone's life. As someone who's had pets and seen that happen, I certainly understand the impact that has on students. But again, something that you see relatively often. And then of course I see, and this is a little bit more of an obscure one, but sometimes students just don't know what to write about. And so they're sitting there in their room, they're sitting at their desk, and they're like, I don't know what to say about myself, so I'm just going to start describing things in my room and how they relate to me. And I know that can seem like an interesting topic, but again, we see that quite a bit, and sometimes that can work, and sometimes it doesn't work. So it just depends on how you sort of write that essay. So these, again, this is not a comprehensive list, just like earlier, but these can be a few of the ones that we see more often. And again, I'm not trying to steer you away from a topic. I'm just sort of letting you know sort of what the landscape looks like, and just know that if you tackle one of these bigger topics that students tend to write about more often, you're going to have to find a way to maybe put a little bit newer spin, or your own real personal touch on that to sort of help it stand out in this process. Kind of as a general rule, as you're thinking about, again, topics, I mean, you may want to avoid the controversial topics in this, or be careful if you choose something that's maybe a little bit more controversial, because there's often multiple eyes that are reading this application. Some may agree with you, some may disagree with you. As a general rule in admissions offices, whether we agree with your essay or not, if it is a well-written essay, if it's about you, that's really ultimately what we're trying to get out of it. But again, just just be careful if you sort of go down that controversial route. Again, you don't necessarily know who is going to actually be on the other side of that. I mean, admissions officers tend to be younger, but then again, as it moves on through the process, into the committee process, into the scholarship process, there could be a wide range of people from all different ages, from all different backgrounds that are looking at this. Sometimes I throw out the examples of maybe best things to avoid. I've heard people seen essays where students write about the bathroom, which seems like an interesting thing to write about, or drugs, or a bitter family situation, and they really get into sort of the details there, or maybe a relationship that they have, and maybe those aren't the things that you want to talk about in this. And then, of course, really, keep that essay clean in this process, and these are just a few of sort of the things maybe you sort of want to steer away from, that you really sort of want to avoid in this process. So again, this is sort of getting back to you being who you are in this process. You, at the end of the day, want to be authentic. So you're not trying to be something that you're not. And I always use this example of, if you're funny, that's great. If you're a funny person and you want to throw in some jokes, or you want to add humor to this essay, that is totally fine with me. But if you're not funny, maybe this isn't the best time to experiment with it for the first time, because you don't quite know how it'll work out. So that's one way you can think about it. But just again, don't try to be something that you're not in this process. Be who you are. Be yourself. That is all that colleges and universities are looking for in this essay. And again, if you decide to go the outrageous route, you can. It may work. It may not work in this process. And I always use this very fun example from when I first started in admissions. There was a girl who wrote an essay about being pooped on by a bird 3 times. To be fair, there probably aren't a lot of people in the world that have been pooped on by a bird 3 times. But when she started the essay with that line, you had no idea how that essay might have been read or reviewed in this process. And honestly, the admissions office was very split. Some people loved it because she took that kind of small, random experience and actually went on to sort of talk about something very, very cool. And other people didn't really like it. But at the end of the day, the admissions office in general sort of appreciated the unique spin that they put on it. But she took a pretty big risk in writing that essay. So again, you can try something like that, but just know you never know sort of how it's going to be reviewed in this process. But it worked in her favor in this process. She ended up being admitted, got a pretty good scholarship at that institution, because she found a way to sort of take this event and this very small, mundane event, and wrote a really compelling essay. But there was a little bit of risk involved there. So just not necessarily telling you to avoid it, but just know if you sort of go the more outrageous route, you never quite know how it might play out in the process. So as you start to work through the draft, you sort of finished up your first draft, you're starting to refine it, you're probably going to be writing multiple drafts. I mean, you kind of want to work on this thing for a little while. I mean, I know it can be tempting when you see 500 words, 600 words. You're like, I know I could write that in one night. So why would I give myself time ahead of that? I can sit down the night before the application is due. I can write that thing, be done with it. I don't need to worry about it. Don't do that, just because, again, it's not so much the length that's a challenge, it's you trying to talk about yourself that I think can be a challenge. And so it's probably going to take you a little while to play around with this essay. Again, I'm not trying to put more pressure on the essay, but you probably want to give yourself just lead time to work through drafts and to get feedback and to, read over it yourself and sort of, think through it quite a bit. But again, don't worry so much about the spelling, the grammar. That's the last thing you can worry about. But think about the ideas you're communicating, how it flows to the reader, the structure, because at the same time that you're communicating something personal about yourself, we also want to see that you have structure, that it's well written in this process. And then, of course, give yourself some time between drafts. Write one, sleep on it, then maybe go back and look at it or give it a couple days. But you don't want to wait too long. You don't want to draft something in May and then don't touch it again until August and then again right before you apply, because you may lose that train of thought. And then also think about, does your essay sort of have this art to it? Is there sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end to this essay? You do want to make sure that it is well structured in this process. Once you sort of get your drafts where you want it to be, it is totally fine to have other people read it. A family member, a teacher, a counselor, a friend who knows you well. But as they're reading this, there's going to be some questions on the next slide that you can sort of give them to think about. But really, here's the goal of this essay. Let's just say you were able to take this essay to school. You've worked really, really hard on this draft, but you forgot to put your name on it because you were working on it, and you left it at school. And so you get home and you're worried because you've now lost all your work in this essay. But if you've written a really, really good essay, a really personal essay, if a classmate picked it up, if a teacher picked it up, if a counselor at the school picked it up and they read it, they'd be giving it back to you the next day because they knew it was about you. So that's sort of a test for you in this process. And again, as you have people read the essay, have them think about some of these things. Tell me, have them respond with, what do you think I'm trying to say, or how am I coming across, or is there anything confusing here, or do I need to add more here? Do you feel like you had enough details? What did you like best? And ultimately, does it sound like you? Is it authentic to who you are? Does it actually sound like you wrote the essay? Or does it sound like someone else wrote the essay? Or does it sound like you went and tried to use all these big vocabulary words just to sound smarter in this process? So think about if it actually sounds like you. At the same time, do be careful if you go around showing this essay to too many people, because lots of people have lots of opinions in this process. And sometimes showing your essay to too many people can lead to trouble. And so at the end of the day, sometimes if it goes around to 7 or 8 different people and you make all their edits and all this and you tweak it, by the time it gets back to you, it doesn't even sound like you wrote it. So you want to make sure that if other people read this essay, that it still sounds like you are the author of this essay by the time it gets back to you. I promise, as we read a lot of essays, we can always tell when a 17 or 18-year-old was the one that wrote this essay, or if it's someone older that wrote this essay. And I'll let you think about who that could be. But also sometimes choosing a primary consultant is not a bad idea. Maybe it's just one person. Maybe it's a friend or a parent or a counselor or a teacher who's sort of your main person that you're sort of going back and forth on this, so you don't get too many voices in this. But again, you are the writer. Even if people are giving you feedback and they want you to cut this or they want you to add this, it is your essay, so you do not have to do that. You are the one that makes the final decisions, the final edits on this essay. All right, and there's some final quick tips here as we're sort of doing this again. Give yourself lots of time. Remember your audience. If you're going to go with some generalizations about things, make sure you give in the details. Again, you don't have to write in a fancy way. If that's very, very long sentences, if that's bringing out the thesaurus, write the way you normally write. That's all we're trying to look for here, because that's how you're going to be writing when you get to our universities and colleges. You're not going to always be pulling out the thesaurus when you get there. So we want to hear from sort of your authentic voice and how you write now. Again, as you're looking at these essays, the directions are pretty straightforward on there, so just make sure you're meeting the directions. If that's a certain format that they're asking for, if that's a certain word count that they're looking for, don't go above the word count. Sometimes students say, well, what if I write below the word count? Will I be penalized for that? And not necessarily. I mean, if you write, if it's a 650-word essay and you write 3 sentences, sure. A college may be a little concerned that you're not putting in the time and energy there. But, if it's a 650-word essay and you write 525 words and you felt like that truly got across the point that you wanted to, I think that can be fine. Sometimes students are a little more concise, a little more to the point, and that's fine. But again, you want to maximize your space the best that you can, so you can certainly do that. Don't necessarily argue with the question while answering it, just sort of tackle it, and make sure that the essay still at the end of the day actually answers the questions. And then of course, we've got, you know, the final sort of proofing at the end. So make sure you look at the words, the grammar, because you want to have that finishing touches. You know, you could have written a really, really good essay, but if it's not well structured, if there are grammatical errors, that can really throw off the reader and can really end up hurting you in this process. And I know it's tempting sometimes just to use the automatic spell check, but as someone who has written a lot of essays in their life, spell check does not catch everything. So make sure you are also doing your own proofreading, and you can even read the essay out loud if you want, and just make sure that if someone were actually reading it, they wouldn't be stumbling because it actually flows and makes sense. So finally, once you've done the proofing, and make sure you do the proofing multiple times, make sure you're submitting the essays and the applications on time. I know that sounds very straightforward, but these deadlines that colleges have are not optional deadlines. They're deadlines you should really be shooting for in the process, and this is really the day that things are due. So a little inspiration for you. I'll just let you read this quote here. But again, hopefully this has been helpful to give you a few pointers, a little bit of direction. At the end of the day, have fun with these essays and let your personality and let your voice shine through. So at this point, I think we'll open it up to a few more questions. I know I probably talked a little longer than I should have. I got carried away. I love essays. I could probably talk a whole another hour about essays. But I will open it up for questions.
Great, Shane. Like, you know, I really appreciate you speaking, you addressing, like, you know, most of the questions that the audience has. So it was very informative to hear how the admission committee takes a look at the overall profile and does an holistic evaluation. So I'll just take up a few of the questions that we have.
Okay.
So,
and I'll be happy to jointly address those questions as well.
Definitely, Anubhooti. So one of the questions that we have from Harish is, can the Common App essay and supplemental essay be a bit similar?
Possibly, but I think you would probably want to try to differentiate them in some ways. It may depend on what that supplemental essay is, and if it's a similar topic to what you chose in the personal essay, there may be some similarities. But definitely what you don't want to do is use the exact same essay, because if an admissions officer sees the same essay, they're going to assume you didn't put the time and energy into the application.
Okay. So we have another question, Anubhooti, if you can take this one up.
Sure. Please let me know.
So there is this question about Ishan. Ishan says, do I need to write a resume or a curriculum vitae to explain the activities that I have participated, or should I include this as well in the essay part?
So basically, essays are meant to respond to specific questions. For example, a Common App essay would be, tell us about a failure, an obstacle you encountered in your life, and what did you learn from it, and how did you grow from it? You know, so this does not have scope to write about other activities and achievements. You can only focus on one topic. So it's a really good idea to, you know, the Common Application has a lot of space to include your academic honors, your activities and other achievements. You really don't need a resume. So a resume is optional. If you think you have a lot to say in terms of your achievements, then I would say, you know, perhaps draft a resume. But at the undergrad level, a one-page resume, if you're applying for the Common App, is definitely not really required, because the Common App covers a lot of your activities and a lot of your achievements anyway. So the focus should be to put that together first and draft great essays. Resume is optional. It's not necessarily required in an undergrad application.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Anubhooti, for the answer. Ishan, I hope, like, you know, that answers your query. So we have another very, I guess, like, you know, really nice question from Manish Jain here. So how much is the university specific customization play a role when you are writing an essay? So basically Manish wants to understand, do the student requires to specifically tailor-made a particular essay when they are addressing a particular university? If you can take it, Shane.
Absolutely. So if you are using the Common Application, Universal College Application, Coalition Application, this personal statement that you write on that application is going to every single school that you apply to. So it needs to be more general in nature. And when I say more general, I mean it can still be very specific about you and be a personal essay about you, but it should not specifically address that school. I can't tell you, and this is not doesn't happen so much anymore, but when the Common Application first came out, I saw a lot of students that sort of forgot about that, and they'd write an amazing, compelling essay, and at the very end say, this is why I wanted to go to this school. And so I'm sure when the school got the essay, they were excited, but every other school that got that essay was probably a little disheartened that they were going to go to this other school. So keep that in mind. It's when you get to the supplemental essays, and they will all be pretty straightforward here, that it's a supplemental essay for this particular school. That is when you can write a little bit more specifically to that school.
And I mean, at this point, I just wanted to ask Mahesh, the student who's asked this question, is he an high school student, or is he a student currently in college? Because generally, the undergrad questions on the Common App, or writing supplements for specific colleges and universities at the undergrad level are very different. So there isn't so much of a you don't have that much of a space to kind of use that across multiple universities. But that kind of sounded a question that more undergrad students in India who are applying for master's education in the US ask.
Okay, so thanks a lot for sharing that insight, Anubhooti. Manish, I guess, like, if you are looking forward to pursuing your undergraduation from USA, so you should keep in mind what Anubhooti has shared. So there aren't much of a specific customization. You do have an option in Common App where you can address specific essays, and then there are supplemental essays, so you should probably focus on that. Okay, so I'll just take maybe 2 more questions before we wrap up the Q&A round. So I have this another questions in terms of the SAT score and how complementary is the structure. So the question reads that I have a strong SAT, but like somehow I'm not very good with the word. So what should I do about it?
So more so like strong testing, but not such a good writer. Is that what I'm getting here?
Yeah, like something on those lines.
Sure. I mean, any college in the United States is evaluating your application, and when you go there, you're going to have to write for a lot of your classes. It's not just tests that you're taking. I mean, you're going to be writing. So you still need to put together a strong essay. But again, it is the holistic process. So certainly we're going to see the strong testing, we're going to see maybe the strong academic performance and other things that are there, but we still want to hear from you. We still want to see that you communicate effectively in this essay. So you want to put your best foot forward, the best that you can in this essay. But at the same time, we know not everyone's going to be a writer or a journalist or an English major at our schools. There are going to be others that are doing sciences and other things that maybe don't require as much writing. They're still going to require some writing. So, we keep those things in mind. We keep that context in mind as well.
Fair enough. So, Anubhooti, we have this another question.
Yes, please.
So, Gurleen is asking that most of the members of the admission committee are somewhere in a range of 23 to 64 years old. So should we keep that into the consideration while writing the essay?
You really have to just think about yourself, Gurleen. You have to only think about who you are, which university you're applying to. Don't try and please an admissions officer. They don't really look at application essays from a biased view. They travel widely, they see different countries, they know different education systems. They are very open people, and they evaluate you from where you come from, So if you're a CBSE student, they evaluate you against students who've taken up CBSE, I mean, they won't evaluate you in totally out of context. So don't try and impress them or write something for them. You have to just put your best foot forward, be true to yourself, be genuine. And one thing I just want to touch upon here, I know the scope of the presentation today is essays, and we would hope to do another session on best fit, because I think students who've asked questions here really need to know about best fit. It's really, you have to, before you apply to a university, you need to see whether you're going to be a happy student there. You need to know about their academic culture, the setting, where are they located, what are their requirements, how selective they are before you apply. you know. So if you're applying to a good fit universities, your chances of getting admission are higher. In the US, universities that have a very difficult admissions process are known as highly selective universities. And they, there's a range of universities: highly selective, moderately selective, selective, less selective. So you need to kind of evaluate your own background and then see if you're a good fit for the university. You don't have to cater your essay to an admissions officer. Shane, you want to just chime in right now?
I was going to say, everything you just said is 100% accurate. You should never be trying to please someone on the other end or writing specifically to a person or to an office, because, again, we don't have this formula that we're looking for. There is no perfect essay. There are so many different types of essays that can really stand out and be successful in this process. Write about you, put your best foot forward, be authentic. That's all you got to do.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for sharing those insights, Shane. So just last question, it's just a light question before we wrap up this Q&A. So there is this Rishabh Kaushik with us. He says that I do beatboxing, and it is slightly strange for me to mention it in the essay. So should I go ahead? Should I do that? Or he's a bit concerned whether he can talk about beatboxing or he can't.
That's completely up to the student. I mean, if that's what he's passionate about. Again, when we're thinking about what are students doing outside the classroom, what are their hobbies, what are their passions, again, we don't have a set list of things that we're looking for. If that's beatboxing, that's great. Now, he can choose to mention that in the extracurricular activities and then show a different side of himself in the essay, or if beatboxing is something that defines him and he wants to somehow use that as a topic, as a jumping off point, go for it. He's not the first beatboxer I've ever read, so that is certainly an activity I see students do, so I wouldn't shy away from that. I don't think you have to worry about that. But again, you can decide if you want it to just be in your extracurriculars, if you want to use it as an essay topic. I'll leave that up to the student.
Well, we can take a few more questions, maybe just a couple more, because we're enjoying this, so we don't mind taking a few more questions.
Okay, fair enough, Anubhooti. So we do have another question in terms of plagiarism. So there is this, they want to check, if how sensitive can this issue be, whether the authenticity of the essay is something that the student should keep in mind. So if you can address that.
I think I'll let Shane address this, but he's going to be the right person to address this.
Fair
So,
enough. Shane, you can kind of take it.
If there's any takeaway that you have from this, what we've talked about, I mean, you are the author of this essay. It should be about you. You shouldn't have to hop online and Google amazing college essays and even be tempted to copy and paste and plagiarize in this process, because you don't need to do that, because that essay is probably not even going to be about you. That's going to be about somebody else, and you're going to try and maybe adapt it to you, but it's still not yours. But it needs to be your voice. It needs to be who you are in this process. Plagiarizing an essay, copying something online, it's probably been done before. I'm sure we've seen it, and that can very negatively affect your application. But again, you don't need to be online even looking at all these mock essays, because if you're really sitting down and brainstorming ideas that are yours and your story and who you are, that's going to be personal and original to you, and you're not even going to have to worry about plagiarizing an essay because you're going to be the author of that essay.
Thank you, Shane, for the answer. So I hope that answers your query. So Anubhooti, I just hand over.
Sure. No, I just wanted to say that plagiarism is a concept that not a lot of Indian students are aware of. So I just want to spell out what plagiarism means. Plagiarism is basically quoting or presenting someone else's ideas in your own words or as it is without acknowledging them. So it's basically copying. It's basically copying somebody without acknowledging them and presenting it as your own work. And this is a very, very serious offense in the US. I mean, in India also, it's just that a lot of students don't know about it. And academic honor code, basically that you have to sign and you have to pledge towards, says that you will not present someone else's work as your own. So I would just request students to be very, very aware of this, because in the US it's a very serious offense and something that's taken up at a very serious level. So don't even go that way.
I might also add something here, other parts of the application too. You know, if you're self-reporting test scores, secondary test scores, or you're including when you're making your activity list, these should actually be the things that you're doing. You do not want to lie about things or add things to your application that aren't true, because I promise that we will always find out about that. So you just want to be yourself, and that's all you have to be throughout this entire application process.
Over to you,
Over.
Mahesh.
Yeah, Anubhooti. So Anubhooti, like, would you want to share about Education USA a bit?
Yes. If any of you, whoever has your presentation on the screen right now, on the webinar right now, if you could move the slide. Yeah. Okay. I'm sharing my screen. Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Right. I guess you guys can now.
Yeah, we can.
So basically, Education USA has 7 centers around the country, and Delhi is the headquarters where I'm based out of. And we have walk-in centers. We have centers with some of the best books on test preparation, SAT, ACT, TOEFL, GRE, GMAT, etc. And if you want to look out for our center, just type into educationusa.state.gov. This is where you'll get information about all our centers. You can also check out our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Education USA Delhi for Delhi. If you're looking out of Mumbai, then it's going to be Education USA Mumbai, and similarly, other cities. But educationusa.state.gov is where you'll find plenty of resources on applying to the US, understanding the process, and finding our center and events. Every Friday at 4 o'clock, we have webinars, and the link for the webinar is on your screen. It's the bit.ly link. That's where we bring a lot of US universities and advisors to talk to students about different aspects of the application process throughout the year. So be sure to check that out. And also, if you're on Twitter, then check out twitter.com/edusa_India. That's where we post our events, scholarship updates, and just a whole lot of very interesting material on application to the US. So that's it for us, our contact information. I hope students have noted it down. And it was a pleasure talking to all the students. These are where our 7 centers are located.
Great. So thank you everyone for joining in the webinar.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us.
So if there were any questions that were unaddressed, you can reach us out on studyabroad@shiksha.com. And thanks again, guys. Thanks again, Shane, and thanks again, Anubhooti, for spending your time and sharing valuable insights with these students. I hope you enjoyed the session.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.